Welcome to Answer Dish, the show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Dugnan. I'm remiss to say that our current era is the quote-unquote weirdest or strangest time when it comes to Western relationships with nutrition, because it's always been weird, but I have to admit that it's certainly in an intensified era of anxiety and uncertainty. It can be a lot to wade through, especially as online discourse from influencers and fitness trainers and celebrities start to weigh in on what to eat and how to eat it. So how can we practice managing our relationship with food in more stable and consistent ways? My guest this week, Stephanie Voytek, is a registered dietitian, and she's here to talk through some of these key issues. She has a range of experience working in the field of nutrition, from providing education to the community through food access programs, working in the fields and kitchens on farms, and counseling folks with eating disorders. Her range of work experience allows her to understand people and find that entry point for nutrition-related behavioral change in each community and individual. Her work emphasizes pleasure as a central component of nutrition education, replacing nutrition prescription with food connection as a central intervention. In today's conversation, we're diving further into the idea of pleasure and intuition as it relates to nutrition. These are terms that can get thrown around a little bit willy-nilly, especially in wellness spheres. But as Stephanie points out, there's actually a lot of scientific and evolutionary value in looking at these concepts as they relate to our appetites and our eating behaviors. We also speak to the significant impact that industrialized and post-World War II era food systems have had on our modern reckonings with food. And she provides tips on finding supportive and good matches when you're looking for dietitian service providers. Here's my conversation with Stephanie. All right, welcome to the show, Stephanie. How are you doing today?
How are you?
Good. I'm so excited to chat with you. I know we've connected a little bit online, and it's exciting to get to learn more about your work. Do you mind sharing for folks tuning in a bit about who you are, where you're coming in from today, and the type of work that you do?
Yeah, my name is Stephanie. I'm a dietitian, and I've worked in various settings in my career in community nutrition. I worked on hospitality farms and spent a majority of my career counseling folks with eating disorders. So I have a range of experiences, but my thread in my career is helping people connect with food in their bodies.
Awesome. I'm really excited to see how you blend all of those experiences together, because I feel like a lot of people tend to operate in silos, especially when it comes to nutrition. And so I'm thrilled that you have all of these different experiences. So can you speak to how these experiences and your philosophies inform your approach towards nutrition?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I agree too. I would say that, I would love to be able to give you a list of my philosophies, but ultimately, my philosophy is nutrition itself. So, culturally, I think we see nutrition as something that's very sterile. It's like a narrow interpretation of the definition of nutrition. Nutrition is kind of like the combination of biological and chemical processes in which our body obtains nutrients from food. But I think that definition accidentally gets reduced to digestion and metabolism, which is a mistake because the process in which our body obtains nutrients starts even before we start eating, right? Our drive to seek out food is physiologically informed, and that's part of nutrition too. So I do kind of take this big holistic integrative approach, and understanding every part of our relationship with food to help people better connect.
That's pretty incredible. And I'm curious if you can talk a bit more about that, physiological drive. And I know you do a lot of work within the space of looking at intuition with eating. I find that's, as you said, that's something that we just don't necessarily see as much in the nutrition world. Can you talk a little bit more about that physiological drive and what sorts of elements inform how we seek out those foods?
There's a few different ways. Hunger is a biological drive, our stomach hunger. When our stomachs are empty, we release a bunch of hormones that motivate us to seek out food. But also, those hunger hormones are kind of coupled by a cascading event of pleasure hormones being released too, and releasing dopamine, and that kind of motivating us to seek out food. But our bodies and brains have been able to connect those pathways with the physical experience of seeking out food. I don't know if I'm really answering your question.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think a lot about, anthropologically, when you talk about what sorts of foods our ancestors were eating, a lot comes up in terms of what was available, maybe what was not so available, like more sweet foods, things like that. and how those impact us as they become more accessible through time. Like that's definitely a theme that is talked about like within food anthropology of navigating, modern landscapes and kind of ancient hardwiring in our bodies. So I guess I'm curious too, because I know you look at this idea of intuition in your work. So how does that come into, working within, how does intuition play into your work?
Well, like food is intuitive and our experience with nutrients is intuitive. And to your point, like I think a lot of us are kind of struggling with how do we navigate our current food system and having hyper palatable foods when our desire for them has like developed over a really long time. And now those foods are super accessible in ways that are not traditional. And I think that like our interest in them is a reflection of our evolution and we can still learn from that. I don't think we have to be afraid of it as long as we like approach it mindfully. So when I say that intuition, when I incorporate intuition as part of my work, nutrition creates intuition. And the pleasure we seek from food is biologically driven and reflected from nutrient profiles. So palatability is not random. It's not luck. Palatability is an agreement our body is made with food to detect the nutrients we need. And pleasure is our body's like interoceptive indicator of nutrition. So in order for us to perform any task, we have to be motivated to do it. Like I said before, stomach hunger is like a biological drive to help us seek out food. It's enhanced and reinforced by pleasure. And food tastes better when we're hungry because when you're hungry,
Yeah.
you're in urgent need of receiving energy from food, right? Like, have you ever been like super full and tried to take an extra bite of food and it just like your whole body rejects it? That is your body's intuition. It's communicating with you what you need and what you don't. And to be even like more specific with that, every sensory experience from food is kind of a meeting of a nutrient to our body. So when we get excited when we see like a really bright color in food, that's created by an
Mm.
antioxidant. Or the crunch in like a vegetable is created by fiber and water, two nutrients that we really need. And it took me a really long time, but right now I'm obsessed with fennel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, when I was younger, I hated fennel, but now I'm
Me
like
too.
obsessed with like licorice flavoring. And that flavor is created by an antioxidant called anethol, which is found in star anise and basil and coriander and lemon balm. And it produces a kind of like exciting licorice flavor to help us seek it out, but it also provides like all these protective events or protective aspects for our body. So
Wow.
the food that we eat, like, or the pleasure that we receive from food is created by nutrients, and that's why
That's wild. Thank you for explaining that because it's one of those things where even if you may kind of like implicitly understand it, having that pathway to like makes a lot more sense. I think about like that, is it the litmus test? Where or like there's like a PCR tab where some people can like put it on their tongue and taste bitterness and then some people can't as well. That kind of came up as you were talking.
Yeah, and so like I've never been able to do that, but I've worked with eating disorders and folks with ARFID, and it's really interesting because there are some folks who like they are more sensitive, but they're also less risk averse. And then there's people who have more taste buds and are more risk averse. So like there's people who are like sensory seekers and sensory avoiders, but they might both have like those, my gosh, what is it? Higher concentrations of papillae or whatever.
Wow, that's really interesting.
When it comes to like pleasure and nutrition too, I think, what I meant before by like nutrition is a science that is also occurring outside of our body at the same time. Plants, the things that we consume have a purpose for providing us nutrients too.
Mm.
So like a good example is a really unripe fruit, say like a strawberry. It doesn't taste good. It's bitter, it's sour, it's pale in color. It's very difficult to chew, or it's more difficult to chew. It's not interesting. Our body is averse to it, right? And that there's an intention behind that, right? Like if a fruit is immature, it doesn't have mature seeds, and every living being wants to reproduce. So the fruit will wait until the seeds are mature and ready to produce offspring to kind of create aspects that would be interesting to us. So as it matures, it gets sweeter. It develops depth of flavor that's created by like antioxidants and flavonoids. It creates a depth of color and encourages us to seek it out. And then we eat it, we enjoy
Mm.
it, we carry the seeds in our poop. And
Yep.
then the strawberry or the fruit gets to spread, and we both go along healthy and happy and keep producing offspring. So, like, nutrition, in my opinion, nutrition is like this like really big science, and understanding nutrition and science is a more intuitive science. I think it just like helps everybody because we all see these things and experience it within our daily lives, and it's much easier for people to like latch onto when they can actually connect with it.
Yeah, yeah. And as you're saying it, it's something that I've taken so for granted. And it makes total sense when you're explaining it, but I've never really thought about why there's certain times where a fruit is not desirable to me. So that's so fascinating.
Right?
Yeah, I think a lot too, like I work with a lot of Indigenous peoples up in Canada, and a lot of those relationships between, plants and different species, like those are talked about more explicitly within, diverse Indigenous foodways than we necessarily see in like a very hyper traditional Western food culture. And I know you've got some really great writing where you're looking at Western industrialism and the impact that that's had on our food. So can you share a little bit about, how you approach that work and your thoughts on that?
Gosh,
A big one.
it feels so relevant right now for like a reason
Mm.
I'm just not going to get into, because it's
Hmm.
like you can write essays, you can write book. There are books written on this. But yeah, so I think, we have, at least in the States, and I'm sure we are too, having this big conversation about industrialized foods. But there's not a lot of conversation about like where is that coming from. I think in the anti-diet space, it's being talked about a lot, but a lot of our foods are processed, but also our nutrition and our nutrition messaging is kind of processed too. It's like industrialized,
Mm.
mechanized. And back around World War II, there was this huge push to kind of improve our access to to nutrients to improve nutrient deficiencies. And we had major discoveries in food systems. So it was the first time where we were able to like break down food to just their nutrients. And our government also, which, I think it was like a really great start, regardless of what other people's opinions are right now. But the government introduced the first dietary guidelines to help give folks clear parameters on how to quantify nutrients in their foods and diets. But also, the dietary guidelines were established to also like measure the health of community or the larger community and build social programs to support those goals. So that, coupled with like major technological advancement and then people coming home from war and like having convenience food available that's packaged and is like providing stability and comfort after a period of time with like a lot of uncertainty and food scarcity, like processed foods and even like this more mechanical way of observing nutrition, it just became part of our culture. I think that, we can all do work to step away from that, but it doesn't have to look the same for everyone. Like, as a
Mhm.
dietitian, I would encourage other dietitians to connect with people over food, to get away from like assembly foods. Like, I love a salad, but like salads and bowls, and just like give people stews and curries and
Yeah,
foods that are traditional, right? Like, those have all the nutrients that we need.
totally.
We don't need to build new foods unless we really want to, but let the chefs do that. And then I think, for folks, in the States would support like native people getting connected with local foodways, but also anyone to just get connected with food however they can, whether it's heritage foods or just like cooking with your friends and gardening. Anything that helps you enjoy food more will better your diet.
Yeah, and I love the distinction you're making too about, the mechanical approach to eating and to like food processing and nutrition messaging versus that very like community forward approach that you're talking about as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's like hard because
Y-
we're separated from community,
Yeah.
but I would encourage, that's what like other providers should think about, is connecting people with one another, and our diets will just kind of like fall into place.
Yeah. Do you know what's interesting actually now that I'm thinking about it is the Canadian Food Guide when it was updated last in 2019, that was like a part of the food guide itself was have meals, like share meals with other people was one of the pieces in that, which was like the first time Canada acknowledged the like social and cultural components to nutritional health as well.
Yeah. Yeah, we have been like pushing, family meals for a pretty long time, but like we had SNAP education, which were like programs that would connect people with food and skills, which was cut. And I think that's what people, if I could give a plug, a food assistance program offers so much more than food. It offers
Yeah.
skills and education and connection and tools. So we really, really need them.
Yeah, 100%. And I think like dignity too. Like I was speaking with like a food services manager at one of the food banks up here in Canada, and that was like a piece too, right? Is like meeting people where they're at and giving them like dignified access and education is a huge part too.
Yeah, and I think, I want to start creating like a different, if anyone has one, like a new phrase to replace meeting people where they're at, because it's a great one.
Mm,
But I even feel like sometimes it's misused. Like you didn't misuse it, but sometimes I feel like it is used by folks to like look down on people.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah,
Yep.
you didn't
Yep.
use it that way, but I've noticed it being used that way when, like, no, everyone wants to enjoy food. Everyone wants access to food. The idea that people
Yes.
without food access, or people who are living in poverty, or even people who have money, the idea that they don't know anything about nutrition and they don't want healthy meals,
Hmm.
it's just not true. We just all have our own life experiences and barriers.
Totally. Yes, very well said. And I think it really speaks to how certain people perceive the food landscape and food insecurity at this really particularly challenging time in or like era, I think, of food and culture in terms of navigating the wellness era components, like new age healthism wellness pieces. Can you speak a bit to like how you navigate that in your practice and how you approach it? Because it's, I always struggle with there's certain elements that are really enticing, and then there are certain parts that can be quite dangerous or quite stigmatizing of other people. So like how do you kind of work through and make sense of that?
I really do practice the way I want other people to function. I've learned as a provider for sure, just like telling people not to do things doesn't work. Redirecting their language and giving them other options without even like directly calling out what they're doing wrong is very
Mm,
helpful.
awesome.
But otherwise, like, I think, wellness brands, big grocery chains, and wellness products and food products, they really do speak to like what's missing. I said before, people know a lot about nutrition, but also there's a lot that they're unsure of. Like, I had a friend ask me recently, what is fiber? I was so grateful they were asking me
Right.
what fiber was. But now I understood, oh, the reason why they buy a fiber supplement is because they don't know what fiber is. Here they are. They're like, great, I know I'm getting it in my diet, when they already cook all their meals and
Mm,
probably have plenty. So I think, I think like marketing is really good to speaking to uncertainty and giving us certainty, giving us clarity, but also like, yeah, responding to things that are just kind of missing in our relationship with food. But it's complicated because, new age, like you said, it has these ideas of like, it promotes like purity culture within food, but new age isn't new. New age
yeah.
is like, it's cyclical. Like purity culture came from the last cycle. I forgot what it was called, which is so embarrassing, but it was similar to new age. But in the late 19th century, we had a bunch of other like spiritual movements that promoted purity of food and purity in our body, and it cycles.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad that you bring that up because I find, I mean, particularly with like an internet loaded perspective, those cycles, that history gets very lost, and the attention span is like what happened in the last 2 to 3 years. And as you're speaking to that too, I think a lot about when you see more wellness oriented brands and branding, it tends to be very focused on specifics of does it have fiber, does it have protein, instead of that more holistic approach that you speak to and that they kind of tout usually. So for your clients, like how do you kind of speak to navigating that landscape when you're in a grocery store and you're trying to make these choices where there's almost a sense of paralysis of like, well, how do I, like, what foods can I eat, or like how do I make sense of this very accessible and almost overwhelming landscape of food?
Just
Yeah.
conversations, right? So, like, just starting with the basics of like, what are these terms? What are carbs? What's protein? Just breaking down nutrition in a really simple form, helping them understand how those nutrients impact their body and how they can get a sense for that, like getting them in touch with their interoceptive awareness. And I find that interoceptive awareness, it helps them, gain connections but also it does help them like hold cognitive dissonance and discomfort when they're in the grocery store or when they're shopping for themselves. Yeah, yeah, holding space for everything, really.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like practice too, because that's just one of those things where, yeah, the more you do it, the more you can figure it out. You speak in your writing too, like you've got a really great newsletter where you're exploring a lot of these themes in depth. And I enjoy, like, the whole time I'm reading them, I'm always like vigorously head shaking yes, because
Wow. Thanks.
it's great, great points.
Yeah. I'm also impressed you read my Substack because I am all over the place with it. And it shows, like, your questions show that you actually read it, and I applaud you for that because I think it's hard.
No, I love it because I find it's like, especially when I'm having a day where I'm overwhelmed with the news around food and nutrition and politics and things like that, like grounding myself in other people's work that is calling it out and able to see it really, really helps. So, within your writing, you talk about how there's some spiritual gaps in, when it comes to North American foods and how sometimes, so I'm curious, like, how do brands try to mimic or attempt to fill these gaps through their food branding?
Right. Yeah, well, I think those spirituality gaps that you're referring to are just our connection with food. So like harvesting,
Mm,
growing, cooking, communicating, even song. Like we have songs about food or historically like we have, I don't know, maybe I just have songs about food these days. um yeah, like food connects us to nature and we are part of nature and we desire that. So, something as small, even though it just sounds like a small marketing tactic, but having like seasonally themed products like pumpkin spice everything, that calls to something that we've been connected to forever, right? Like a changing of seasons and certain flavors within those seasons. So I think like brands kind of respond to those spiritual gaps. They also create identity and community when we don't have much.
yeah.
I used to live in downtown Seattle where Starbucks, I don't know. Starbucks is so silly because I can't remember what decade it was created, but I think in the 80s, just by two business guys, right? And like people go to Seattle and are like, oh my God, I can't wait to see the first Starbucks. So they all line up outside of the Pike Place Starbucks that isn't even the first Starbucks. It's like wrapped around the corner. Yeah. And the ironic part is Seattle also has like multiple, what do they call it? Not flagship, but they have, I forgot what Starbucks, they have like a specialty store that is
Okay.
really cool. The tourists don't even go there. So I think it just creates, I think brands are really good at creating such a strong identity and community for folks, kind of like sports and major pop stars that kind of, fills in the gap that we have that used to connect, or for some people still does, connects our diets to our community.
Wow. Yeah. I never thought about that. And especially with like the lack of seasonality quite often in a grocery store with produce where you can have strawberries at any time of year and there's not that distinction too. That's so interesting.
Yeah, and then you tell your friends, you're like, "Oh my God, this product
Yeah.
just came out." When, like, I want my friend to tell me when she's harvesting from her plum tree so we can make jam. Like,
Yeah.
that is something that we might do or we've done before.
Yeah. Yeah, most definitely. There's something you brought up that I wanted to ask you a little more about, and I am forgetting. I think in hearing what you're saying too about Starbucks and like branding kind of telling these stories and mirroring some of our natural inclinations, it makes me think too about a couple years ago. I spoke with like a food brand marketer about how, even some of the origins or like stories that we have about how contemporary easily accessed foods came to be. So like Hungry Man dinners, there's like stories about how that came to be, but it ends up just being like a marketing spin that was a really good story, which I find quite fascinating as like a collective kind of historical approach to food too.
Yeah, and it sells because, like, our brains are wired to follow narratives. We need it to,
Mm.
like, be connected to our identity and community. But yeah, it's interesting how, like, it's just hungry man.
Yep, exactly. But it's got this cool story about turkeys and freezers and stuff like
Right.
that. So
Yeah.
here we are. So I wanted to shift gears a little bit because I know you do some really important work working with people who have eating disorders and, speaking about the ideas of like cueing into hunger or like tapping into hunger cues and things like that. What can we learn in terms of thinking about food anxieties and appetites in this very highly anxious sort of environment that we're finding ourselves in?
I mean, oh, that's a big question.
Mm,
Yeah, it's a big question because, like, anxiety obviously impacts our appetite, but It depends on the type of anxiety, and it also depends on the person that's experiencing it and how long they've experienced it. So, sometimes, for most people's anxiety turns off our stomachs, but for some people, like they might cope by like eating too much. It really depends. So, food anxiety is really complex. And also we're naturally neophobic. Like being afraid of new things protects us and makes us cautious. Also, like when we're experiencing anxiety in general and overwhelm, our brain wants to seek reasons and solutions. And it's much easier to find a reason, to project a reason onto something like our bodies or food, to kind of give us a sense of certainty, but also to be able to practice agency over that anxiety. But working with eating disorders has taught me that our relationship with food is heavily biologically wired, and it gets reflected into our culture, and then our culture, feeds it back to us. But I also like, I don't know if this is controversial. I really do have this belief that our experience or the way we articulate our internal experience is just based on whatever language that we have access to. So,
Yeah, yeah,
I think
makes
the more
sense.
specific, the better. But, eating disorders are definitely culturally informed, but I do think they would exist with or without diet culture. I think diet culture just enhances them and perpetuates them and prevents people from getting diagnosed and receiving treatment. But there's such a range of why people could experience anxiety around food. And we're also flexible. And with the right approach, like people could definitely overcome those anxieties as long as the treatment to resolving it matches the origins of the problem.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and thinking about eating disorders too, I remember back in the days when I was like looking at that in like a more academic setting, the idea of like culturally bound experiences and or like health experiences came up quite a bit because it was not necessarily exclusive to North America, but highly, highly concentrated and manifesting in very particular ways versus like how it would manifest in a culture that was like becoming more globalized and grappling with that.
Right. How so?
So just prevalence, like it was higher levels of like teen girls in like the States than there was. I think there was a study in Papua New Guinea probably 2 decades ago. Like it's very old now. But it wasn't until, they were tracing like when TV came in and like how kids related to TV that they were watching that was like very Americanized cartoons and sitcoms where there were episodes where there might be, a character grappling with an eating disorder. And so seeing those more Americanized images, there was starting to be a correlation with like how kids were thinking about their bodies. So that kind of stuff always interests me too in terms of like the network globally of cultural messaging and how it kind of jumps back and forth between individuals and society.
Yeah. Yeah. And our problems are like not our own.
Hmm.
They are globalized. And they spread.
Yeah, very fast. Yep. Yeah. So we've talked about a lot of like really deeply fascinating and important elements of this conversation. There's a lot to balance in terms of, maintaining approaches to honoring and appreciating cultural foods and nourishment and still, making sense of food safety and science and affordability too. So what are some strategies or resources that you turn to when you're needing to have a moment to recollect amidst all of this?
Honestly, being an expert helps.
Yeah, yeah.
I really do feel bad for other people because I know when I should be concerned about something, I know when I should pause, and I know when I don't need to worry about something. And so I do feel really bad for a lot of folks because, a lot of folks like they want to learn more about nutrition. They're well intentioned, and the books and the documentaries that they have the most access to are all fueled by fear. It's not the way science works. Science is like a complex network. It's a complex web, and everything you do does actually impact everything else. So, messages that you identify with, that you relate to, like you said, we're in a time of like such harsh anxiety. I think reading stories that ground us are helpful. And a story about sharing a meal with your friend is like still a story about nutrition. So I think, you know, I would work with if folks are like nervous about nutrition, I would just work with a registered dietitian. And
Yeah.
if they're still selling you fear, they're not the right one. I think someone who helps you work through and problem solve and holds, conflicting truths and scary feelings and helps you build agency is probably like the right person.
Yeah, thank you. That is really great advice. And thank you so much, Stephanie, for coming on and sharing more about your work. I find it so interesting. Do you mind sharing where people can find you online if they want to follow along and learn more?
Yeah, my social media is so limited and I want to keep it
No
that way.
worries. Yeah, fair.
I might have a website soon, but even that, like, this is too much. I can't do it.
Yeah, get that.
So I publish essays and updates on my Substack. It's a spoonful of stories.substack.com. I do talk about like a range of stuff, nutrition, food related, sometimes personal life, not really. It's kind of like a mess. But kind of just like any food stuff I feel like talking about. I think it's pretty good for folks who are interested in food anthropology. I think women will really identify with it. Yeah, I think just like stories to help ground you in nutrition and food in your body and nature.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you so much, Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you. This is so much fun.
Yeah. That was Stephanie Voytek. I've linked her newsletter on Substack in the show notes below if you want to follow along and learn more. You can also find all this at our website at anthodish.com under episodes. Thanks so much for listening to Anthodish Podcast. Subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you listen. If you like the show, please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help get the word out. For more Anthodish, sign up for my newsletter at sarahdugan.substack.com or find me on TikTok, Instagram, Threads, or Blue Sky at Anthodish Podcast. I always love hearing from you and what you're learning about food. Music production was done by Lucas Wojcicki at lucasound.com. Anthodish is produced in partnership with the American Anthropological Association. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week.